Thank you for joining Wars of the Roses, and this video is Thomas Paine on the origin of Freemasonry, Part 2, starting where we left off on Part 1. The lodges of the Masons, if built for the purpose, are constructed in a manner to correspond with the apparent motion of the sun. They are situated east and west. The master's place is always the east. In the explanation of the entered apprentice, the master, among many other questions, asked him, "How is the lodge situated? East and west." "Why so?" "Because all churches and chapels are ought to be so." This answer, which is mere catechismal form, is not an answer to the question. It does no more than remove the question a point further, which is, why ought all churches and chapels to be so? But as an entered apprentice is not initiated into the druidical mysteries of Masonry, he is not asked any questions to which a direct answer would lead thereto. "Where stands your master?" "In the east." "Why so?" "As the sun rises in the east and opens the day, so the master stands in the east, with his right hand upon his left breast, bearing a sign and the square about his neck, to open the lodge and set his men at work." "Where stand your wardens?" "In the west." "What is their business?" "As the sun sets in the west to close the day, so the wardens stand in the west with their right hands upon their left breast, being a sign, and the level and the plumb rule above their necks, to close the lodge and dismiss the men from labor, paying them their wages." Here the name of the sun is mentioned, but it is proper to observe that in this place it has reference only to labor or the time of labor, and not to any religious druidical rite or ceremony, as it would have with respect to the situation of lodges east and west. I have already observed in the chapter on the origin of the Christian religion that the situation of churches east and west is taken from the worship of the sun, which rises in the east. The Christians never bury their dead on the north side of a church, and a Masonic lodge always has, or is supposed to have, 3 windows, which are called fixed lights, to distinguish them from the movable lights of the sun and the moon. The master asked the inner apprentice, "How are they, the fixed lights, situated? East, west, and south." "What are their uses?" "To light the men to and from their work." "Why are there no lights in the north?" "Because the sun darts no rays from thence." This, among numerous other instances, shows that the Christian religion and Masonry have one and the same common origin, the ancient worship of the sun. The light festival of the Masons is on the day they call St. John's Day. But every enlightened Mason must know that holding their festival on this day has no reference to the person called St. John, and that it is only to disguise the true cause of holding it on this day that they call the day by that name. As there were Masons, or at least Druids, many centuries before the time of St. John, if such a person ever existed, the holding of their festival on this day must refer to some cause totally unconnected with John. The case is that the day called St. John's Day is the 24th of June and is what is called Midsummer's Day. The sun is then arrived at the summer solstice, and with respect to the meridional altitude or height at high noon, appear for some days to be at the same height. The astronomical longest day, like the shortest day, is not every year, on account of leap year, on the same numerical day, and therefore the 24th of June is always taken for Midsummer's Day. and it is in honor of the sun, which has arrived at its greatest height in our hemisphere, and not anything to do with respect to St. John, that this annual festival of the Masons, taken from the Druids, is celebrated on Midsummer's Day. Customs will often outlive the remembrance of the origin, and this is the case with respect to this custom, still practiced in Ireland, where the Druids flourished at the time they flourished in Britain. On the eve of St. John's Day, that is, on the eve of Midsummer's Day, the Irish light fires on the tops of hills. This can have no reference to St. John, but it has emblematical reference to the sun, which on that day is at his highest summer elevation, and might in common language be said to have arrived at the top of the hill. As to what Masons and books of Masonry tell us of Solomon's temple at Jerusalem, it is no ways improbable that some Masonic ceremonies may have been derived from the building of that temple. For the worship of the sun was in practice many centuries before the temple existed, or before the Israelites came out of Egypt. And we learn from the history of their Jewish kings, 2 Kings chapter 22 and 23, that the worship of the sun was performed by the Jews in that temple. It is, however, much to be doubted if it was done with the same scientific purity and religious morality with which it was performed by the Druids, who by all accounts that historically remain of them were a wise, learned, and moral class of men. The Jews, on the contrary, were ignorant of astrology and of science in general, and if a religion founded upon astrology fell into their hands, it is almost certain it would be corrupted. We do not read in the history of the Jews, whether in the Bible or elsewhere, that they were inventors or improvers of any one art or science. Even in the building of this temple, the Jews did not know how to square and frame the timber for beginning and carrying on the work, and Solomon was obligated to send to Hiram, king of Tyre, Zidon, to procure workmen. For thou wouldst know, says Solomon to Hiram, 1 Kings chapter 5 verse 6, that there is not among us any that can skill to hew timber like unto the Zidonians. This temple was more properly Hiram's temple than Solomon's temple. And if the Masons derived anything from the building of it, they owe it to the Zidonians and not to the Jews. But to return to the worship of the sun in this temple, it is said, 2 Kings chapter 23 verse 5, Jodias put down all the idolatrous priests that burnt incense unto the sun, the moon, the planets, and unto all the host of heaven. And it is said at the 11th verse, and he had took away the horses that the kings of Judah had given to the sun at the entering in the house of the Lord, and burned the chariots of the sun with fire. Verse 13, and the high places that were before Jerusalem, which were on the right hand of the mount of corruption, which Solomon, the king of Israel, had built for Ashtoreth, the abomination of the Zidonians. The very people that built the temple did the king defile. Besides these things, the description that Josephus gives of the decorations of this temple resemble on a large scale those of a master lodge. He says that the distribution of the several parts of the temple of the Jews represented all nature, particularly the parts most apparent of it, as the sun, the moon, the planets, the zodiac, the earth, the elements, and that the system of the world was retraced there by numerous ingenious emblems. These, in all probability, are what Josiah, in his ignorance, calls the abomination of the Zidonians. Everything, however, drawn from this temple and applied to Masonry still refers to the worship of the sun, however corrupted or misunderstood by the Jews, and consequently to the religion of the Druids. Another circumstance which shows that Masonry is derived from some ancient system prior to and unconnected with the Christian religion is the chronological or method of counting time used by the Masons in the record of their lodges. They make no use of what is called the Christian era, and they reckon their months numerically as the ancient Egyptians did, and as the Quakers do now. I have by me a record of a French lodge at the time of the late Duke of Orleans, then Duc de Chartres, was Grand Master of Masonry in France. It begins as follows: about with cherubims, and palm trees, and open flowers, and that he made a molten sea, placed on 12 oxen, and that the ledges of it were ornamented with lions, oxen, and cherubims. All this is contrary to the law called the Law of Moses. That is, the 13th day of the 6th month of the year of the Venerable Lodge, 5773. By what I observe in English books of Masonry, the English Masons use the initials AL and not VL. By AL, they mean the year of the lodge, as the Christians by AD mean in the year of the Lord. But AL, like VL, refers to the same chronological error, that is, to the supposed time of creation. Though the Masons have taken many of their ceremonies and hieroglyphics from the ancient Egyptians, it is certain they have not taken their chronology from thence. If they had, the church would soon have sent them to the stake, as the chronology of the Egyptians, like that of the Chinese, goes many thousands of years beyond the Bible chronology. The religion of the Druids, as before said, was the same as the religion of the ancient Egyptians. The priests of Egypt were the professors and the teachers of science, and were styled priests of Heliopolis, that is, the city of the sun. The Druids in Europe, who were the same order of men, have their name from the Teutonic or ancient German language, the Germans being anciently called Teutones. The word Druid signifies a wise man. In Persia, they were called Magi, which signifies the same thing. Egypt, says Smith, from whence we derive many of our mysteries, hath always bore a distinguished rank in history, and was once celebrated above all others for its antiquities, learning, opulence, and fertility. In their system, their principal hero gods, Osiris and Isis, theologically represent the supreme being, and physically the two great celestial luminaries, the sun and the moon, by whose influence all nature was articulated. The experienced brethren of this society, says Smith in a note to this passage, are well informed what affinity these symbols bear to Masonry, and why they are used in all Masonic lodges. In the speaking of the apparel of the Masons in their lodges, part of which, as we see in their public processions, is a white leather apron. He says, the Druids were apparelled in white at the time of their sacrifices and solemn offices. The Egyptian priest of Osiris wore snow white cotton. The Grecian and most other priests wore white garments. As Masons, we regard the principles of those who were the first worshippers of the true God, imitate their apparel, and assume the badge of innocence. The Egyptians, continues Smith, in the earliest ages, constituted a great number of lodges, but with assiduous care kept their secrets of Masonry from all strangers. These secrets have been imperfectly handed down to us by oral tradition only, and ought to be kept undiscovered to the laborers, craftsmen, and apprentices, till by good behavior and long study they become better acquainted in geometry and the liberal arts, and thereby qualified for masters and wardens, which is seldom or ever the case with English Masons. Under the head of Freemasonry, written by the astronomer Lalande in the French Encyclopedia, I expected from his great knowledge in astronomy to find much information on the origin of Masonry. For what connection can there be between any institution and the sun and the 12 signs of the zodiac, if there be not something in that institution or in its origin that has reference to astronomy? Everything used as an hieroglyphic has reference to the subject and purpose for which it is used, and we are not to suppose the Freemasons, among whom are many very learned and scientific men, to be such idiots as to make use of astronomical signs without some astronomical purpose. But I was much disappointed in my expectations from Lalande. In speaking of the origin of Masonry, he says, that is, the origin of Masonry, like others, loses itself in the obscurity of time. When I came to this expression, I suppose Lalande, a Mason, and on inquiry found he was. This passing over saved him from the embarrassment which Masons are under respecting the disclosure of their origin, and which they are sworn to conceal. There is a society of Masons in Dublin who take the name of the Druids. These Masons must be supposed to have a reason for taking that name. I come now to speak of the cause of secrecy used by the Masons. The natural source of secrecy is fear. When any new religion overruns a former religion, the professors of the new become the prosecutors of the old. We see this in all instances that history brings before us. When Hilkiah the priest and Shaphan the scribe in the region of King Josiah found or pretended to find the law, called the law of Moses, 1,000 years after the time of Moses, and it does not appear from the second book of Kings, chapter 22 and 23, that such law was ever practiced or known before the time of Josiah. He established that law as a national religion and put all the priests of the sun to death. When the Christian religion overran the Jewish religion, the Jews were the continual subject of persecution in all Christian countries. When the Protestant religion in England overran the Roman Catholic religion, it was made death for a Catholic priest to be found in England. As this has been the case in all the instances we have any knowledge of, we are obligated to admit it with respect to the case in question, and that when the Christian religion overran the religion of the Druids in Italy, ancient Gaul, Britain, and Ireland, the Druids became the subject of persecution. This would naturally and necessarily oblige such of them as to remain attached to their original religion to meet in secret and under the strongest injunctions of secrecy. Their safety depended upon it. A false brother might expose the lives of many of them to destruction, and from the remains of the religion of the Druids, thus preserved, arose the institution which, to avoid the name of Druids, took that of Mason, and practiced under this new name the rites and ceremonies of Druids. Thank you for watching. Please don't forget to share, like, subscribe, and comment. And if you can, please consider donating a small amount of money to Wars of the Roses. Links to PayPal and Patreon are in the description below. And thank you very much.